The pre-dawn darkness of October 26, 1942, hung thick over the waters northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. In the cramped radar plot room aboard USS Enterprise, radioman second class Robert Morris watched the green phosphorescent sweep of the CXAM air search radar trace lazy circles across the cathode ray tube. The luminous line painted the screen every few seconds, revealing nothing but empty ocean and the friendly combat air patrol circling overhead. Morris had been staring at this screen for 3 hours, his eyes burning from the dim green glow, his mind fighting the fatigue that came with midnight watch rotation. At 0347, a faint blip appeared at the extreme edge of his screen. Morris leaned forward, squinting at the trace. The contact was bearing 040 degrees, range approximately 40 miles. It vanished on the next sweep, then reappeared, slightly closer. Morris's hand moved to the sound-powered phone connecting him to the bridge. He hesitated for perhaps 3 seconds, watching the contact solidify on his screen. Japanese carrier aircraft, inbound. Vice Admiral Kinkaid's Task Force 16 had maybe 90 seconds before those aircraft closed to effective torpedo and bomb release range. But 90 seconds of warning was exactly 89 seconds more than Japanese carrier forces possessed. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force approaching from the opposite direction, had no radar. His lookouts strained their eyes against the darkness, searching for American ships they couldn't possibly see at 40 miles distance. His aircraft were launching blind into the black Pacific sky, navigating by dead reckoning and prayer, hoping to find American carriers somewhere in the vast emptiness of ocean. The battle that would unfold over the next 12 hours would demonstrate with brutal clarity the decisive advantage radar provided in carrier warfare. American forces could detect Japanese aircraft while they were still dots on an electronic screen, invisible to the naked eye. They could vector fighters to intercept positions with mathematical precision. They could track strike packages as they formed up, predict their approach vectors, prepare defensive measures while Japanese aircraft were still too far away to threaten the fleet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese forces possessed no equivalent capability. Their carriers sailed into battle with technology that hadn't fundamentally changed since World War I. Optical rangefinders, human lookouts, visual identification. When American strike aircraft approached Japanese carriers through clouds or darkness, the first warning often came from the sound of diving aircraft or the whistle of falling bombs. By then, it was too late. The radar advantage wasn't theoretical or marginal. It was absolute and decisive. The mathematics of detection range created tactical advantages that skilled seamanship couldn't overcome. An American radar operator could see Japanese aircraft at 40 miles. A Japanese lookout, no matter how well trained or how exceptional his eyesight, couldn't see American aircraft until they were close enough for visual identification, perhaps 5 miles in good conditions, often much less through clouds or haze. This 35-mile differential represented roughly 14 minutes of flight time at typical strike aircraft speeds, 14 minutes to launch additional fighters, 14 minutes to reposition anti-aircraft guns, 14 minutes to maneuver the task force into optimal defensive formation, 14 minutes to prepare damage control parties, 14 minutes that Japanese forces simply didn't have. The technological gap had been building since 1941, but senior officers in both navies were only beginning to understand its implications in October 1942. American radar development had progressed rapidly during 1941 as war approached. The Naval Research Laboratory had been experimenting with radio detection since the 1930s, building prototype systems that demonstrated the basic principle. Radio waves transmitted toward a target would reflect back to the sender, allowing calculation of range and bearing. By 1940, the first production radar sets were being installed on American warships. The CXAM air search radar, operating on meter-long wavelengths, could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 70 miles under ideal conditions. The system was crude by later standards. The antenna was enormous, weighing several tons and requiring complex mounting structures on the ship's mast. The cathode ray tube displays were difficult to interpret, requiring trained operators who understood the equipment's quirks and limitations. But it worked. During Fleet Problem 21 in April 1940, CXAM radar aboard USS California detected incoming aircraft at 68 miles, providing defensive forces with nearly 20 minutes of advance warning. Naval observers who witnessed the demonstration understood immediately that carrier warfare had fundamentally changed. Whoever could see farthest would dominate. The Japanese had radar too, but their development program lagged years behind American and British efforts. Multiple factors contributed to this gap. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive operations and decisive battle concepts that didn't initially prioritize defensive detection systems. Limited industrial capacity meant Japan had to make difficult choices about which technologies to develop. Radar production required precision manufacturing, quality electronics, and skilled technicians that Japanese industry, already strained supporting multiple weapons programs, struggled to provide. More fundamentally, Japanese naval leadership didn't fully understand radar's potential until American forces demonstrated its effectiveness in combat. The first Japanese naval radar, the Type II Mark I air search system, didn't enter service until August 1942. Even then, production was limited. Only a handful of ships carried the equipment by October 1942, and performance was inferior to American systems. Detection range was shorter, displays were less reliable, and operators lacked the training and experience their American counterparts had accumulated. Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier force approaching the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26 included Japan's finest carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, veteran ships that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. Junyo, a converted passenger liner pressed into carrier service. These carriers embarked approximately 200 aircraft, including the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters that had dominated Pacific skies for 10 months. The air crew were experienced, many having flown combat missions since the war's beginning. The maintenance crews were skilled, keeping aircraft operational despite limited spare parts and facilities. The ships themselves were well designed, fast, and maneuverable. But none of Nagumo's carriers mounted functional radar. His force sailed into battle effectively blind beyond visual range, relying on tactics developed before electronic detection existed. The American task force that Nagumo was hunting included Enterprise and Hornet, two of the 4 remaining American carriers in the Pacific after the losses at Coral Sea and Midway. These carriers operated with CXAM radar, providing continuous surveillance of the airspace around them. Fighter direction officers aboard each carrier monitored radar displays, tracking friendly and enemy aircraft, vectoring combat air patrols to intercept positions, maintaining a real-time picture of the tactical situation that Japanese forces couldn't match. The battle began before dawn on October 26, when both sides launched search aircraft to locate the enemy fleet. American search planes, guided by radar operators who had tracked Japanese carrier positions throughout the night, knew approximately where to look. Japanese search aircraft, launched without electronic guidance, covered search sectors based on estimated American positions and operational assumptions. The Japanese found American carriers first through luck and skilled navigation, but the Americans knew Japanese carriers were present before their search aircraft reported contact. Enterprise's CXAM radar had been tracking Japanese search aircraft since they launched, painting their positions on radar screens as they approached the American task force. Fighter direction officers watched the contacts, counted aircraft, estimated their mission, and prepared intercept plans. When Japanese search planes radioed contact reports back to their carriers, American radio, intelligence operators intercepted the transmissions and began direction-finding procedures to locate the source. The technological advantage compounded itself. American forces knew where Japanese carriers were because they'd tracked Japanese search aircraft back to their launch point using radar and radio direction finding. Japanese forces knew where American carriers were because their search aircraft had visually sighted them and radioed reports. Both sides possessed the information they needed to launch strikes, but the Americans had obtained theirs through technology that provided continuous updates, while Japanese information was fragmentary and already outdated. At 0629, Admiral Kinkaid ordered Enterprise and Hornet to launch full strike packages against the Japanese carrier force. 73 aircraft, a mix of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and Wildcat fighters for escort, roared off the flight decks into the dawn. Sky. The strike group formed up and headed northwest toward the last known position of Japanese carriers, approximately 200 miles distant. Vice Admiral Nagumo, unaware that American radar had been tracking his fleet throughout the night, launched his own strike force at 0700. 65 aircraft, including Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters, climbed away from their carriers and turned southeast toward American positions. The opposing strike packages would pass each other in mid-flight, racing toward targets that were maneuvering defensively. What happened next demonstrated the radar advantage with mathematical precision. At 0810, Enterprise's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 41 miles. The radar operator called out the contact to the fighter direction officer, who immediately vectored additional Wildcat fighters from the combat air patrol toward intercept positions. The fighters climbed to altitude, positioned themselves between the Japanese strike and the American carriers, and waited. Japanese strike leader Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki had no idea American fighters were waiting ahead. He had no radar warning of their presence. His formation flew straight toward the ambush, maintaining standard attack approach, while American fighters maneuvered into optimal attack positions based on continuous radar updates from Enterprise. The first indication Seki had of enemy fighters came when Wildcats dove through his formation, guns blazing. The Japanese strike absorbed heavy losses during the approach. American fighters, guided by radar to perfect intercept positions, shot down multiple aircraft before the strike reached the American carriers. Those Japanese aircraft that survived the fighter attacks then faced intense anti-aircraft fire from ships that had been prepared for their arrival since radar first detected them at 41 miles. The American strike approaching Japanese carriers faced no equivalent opposition. Nagumo had no radar warning of approaching aircraft. His combat air patrol flew standard defensive patterns without specific guidance toward the incoming threat. Japanese lookouts finally spotted American dive bombers at perhaps 5 miles, giving defenders maybe 2 minutes of warning. Japanese fighters scrambled frantically, clawing for altitude, trying to reach attack positions before American bombers began their dives. They failed. American dive bombers rolled into their attacks, while Japanese fighters were still climbing thousands of feet below effective intercept altitude. The bombs fell in near-perfect patterns, targeting carrier flight decks with precision born from training and unhurried approach. Multiple bombs struck carrier Shokaku, wrecking her flight deck and starting fires that raged through her hangar. The carrier survived but was knocked out of action for months. The tactical advantage radar provided manifested in every phase of the battle. American carriers detected threats earlier, prepared defenses more effectively, and coordinated responses more efficiently than Japanese forces could match. Japanese carriers, operating without radar, reacted to threats they could see visually, which meant reacting to threats that were already attacking them. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Japanese strike aircraft approached American carriers and were detected at extreme range by radar. Fighter direction officers vectored interceptors to optimal positions. American fighters, guided by continuous radar updates, attacked Japanese formations while they were still miles from their targets. Japanese aircraft that survived fighter attacks encountered anti-aircraft fire from ships that had been tracking their approach electronically for 10 minutes or more. American strike aircraft approaching Japanese carriers faced disorganized, improvised defenses. Japanese fighters scrambled when lookouts spotted incoming aircraft, often too late to intercept effectively. Anti-aircraft gunners engaged targets they could see, which meant targets that were already committed to their attacks. The entire Japanese defensive system operated reactively, responding to threats after they appeared rather than preparing for threats detected at distance. At 0840, a second Japanese strike launched from carrier Junyo, attempting to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. 40 aircraft headed toward Enterprise and Hornet, maintaining tight formation, their pilots confident they could punch through American fighter screens and deliver crippling blows to the carriers. Enterprise's radar detected them at 38 miles. Fighter direction officers had 12 minutes to prepare. What those 12 minutes meant in practical terms was the difference between chaos and coordinated defense. 12 minutes allowed Enterprise to recall fighters from distant patrol stations. 12 minutes allowed damage control, parties to pre-position near likely hit locations. 12 minutes allowed anti-aircraft crews to prepare ammunition and verify equipment function. 12 minutes allowed the carrier to maneuver into optimal defensive heading, presenting minimum target profile while maximizing fields of fire for escort destroyers. Japanese carrier crews had no equivalent preparation time. When American dive bombers appeared overhead, they appeared suddenly, emerging from clouds or sun glare with perhaps 30 seconds of warning before bombs began falling. Japanese damage control parties scrambled to battle stations after attacks commenced. Japanese anti-aircraft crews engaged targets that were already diving toward their ships. Japanese carriers maneuvered frantically, turning hard to throw off bomb aiming, but the maneuvers began after American pilots had already calculated release points. Lieutenant Stockton Strong, flying an SBD Dauntless from Hornet, later described approaching carrier Zuikaku through broken clouds. His formation had climbed to 14,000 feet, well above the cloud layer, invisible to Japanese lookouts scanning the sky below. Strong watched the carrier through gaps in the clouds, timing his attack, waiting for optimal position. When he rolled into his dive, the first indication Zuikaku's crew had of imminent attack was the sound of Strong's dive brakes deploying as he plunged through the cloud layer. Strong's 1,000-pound bomb struck Zuikaku's flight deck near the forward elevator, penetrating into the hangar before exploding. The detonation ignited aviation fuel and ammunition, starting fires that required hours to control. Zuikaku survived but was knocked out of the battle, her flight deck wrecked, her hangar bay devastated. The entire attack from Strong's initial dive to bomb impact consumed perhaps 20 seconds. Zuikaku's defenders had no time to prepare, no time to maneuver effectively, no time to do anything except watch bombs fall. The contrast with Japanese attacks on American carriers was stark. When Japanese aircraft approached Enterprise at 0932, they were detected at 36 miles. Enterprise's fighter direction officer, Lieutenant Commander John Griffin, had been tracking the formation for nearly 9 minutes when he vectored 4 Wildcat fighters to intercept position. The Wildcats, guided by continuous radar updates, climbed to 20,000 feet and positioned themselves directly in the Japanese flight path. The Japanese strike leader never saw them until Wildcats were already firing, tearing into his formation from above and behind. Multiple Japanese aircraft went down in flames during the initial pass. The formation broke apart, aircraft scattering to evade the fighters, losing cohesion and mutual support. When surviving aircraft reformed and pressed their attack, they faced anti-aircraft fire from ships that had been tracking their approach for 15 minutes. The pattern was mathematical and inexorable. Radar detection at extreme range created time. Time created preparation. Preparation created effective defense. Effective defense reduced damage and preserved combat capability. Preserved combat capability allowed continued operations. The technological advantage compounded across multiple attack cycles until Japanese striking power was exhausted while American capabilities remained largely intact. By noon on October 26th, the battle had reached its climax. Enterprise had sustained 2 bomb hits, but remained operational, her flight deck damaged but capable of recovering aircraft. Hornet had absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits and was dead in the water, burning, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship. On the Japanese side, Shokaku was heavily damaged and withdrawing. Zuikaku had been hit and was struggling with fire control. Junyo remained operational but was running low on aircraft. The crucial difference was information. American commanders knew the status of Japanese carriers with reasonable accuracy. Radar had tracked Japanese aircraft launches throughout the battle, allowing estimation of remaining Japanese air strength. Radio intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, providing fragmentary but useful information about damage and casualties. Scout aircraft had photographed damaged Japanese carriers, confirming their condition. Japanese commanders operated with fragmentary and outdated information. They knew American carriers were present somewhere to the southeast. They knew their strike aircraft had attacked American ships and reported hits. But they didn't know current American carrier status, remaining American air strength, or whether damaged American carriers were still operational. They were fighting blind in a battle where sight distance determined survival. Admiral Nagumo, reviewing damage reports from Shokaku and Zuikaku, calculating remaining aircraft strength, and considering ammunition and fuel status, made the decision to withdraw at 1400 hours. His carriers had been badly hurt. His aircraft strength was depleted. His ability to launch additional strikes was limited. He could continue fighting, trading blows with American forces in a battle of attrition, or he could withdraw, preserve his remaining strength, and concede tactical defeat. The decision was influenced heavily by the unseen technological factor that had dominated the battle. Nagumo knew American carriers could detect his aircraft at distances his forces couldn't match. He knew his strikes faced better coordinated defenses than his carriers could organize. He knew the radar advantage was absolute and couldn't be overcome through superior seamanship or pilot skill. Continuing the battle meant accepting losses he couldn't afford against an enemy possessing technological superiority he couldn't counter. American forces claimed tactical victory at Santa Cruz, though the cost was heavy. Hornet was eventually abandoned and sunk after efforts to save her failed. Enterprise was damaged and would require repairs. American aircraft losses were severe, with many experienced pilots killed. But the battle demonstrated conclusively that radar provided decisive advantages in carrier warfare that Japanese forces couldn't match. The implications rippled through both navies over the following months. American naval leadership, reviewing after-action reports, understood that radar had been the decisive factor. Not superior aircraft, not better pilots, not tactical brilliance, but electronic detection that provided information advantages which translated directly into combat effectiveness. Orders went out immediately to accelerate radar installation on every combat vessel. Training programs were established to develop more fighter direction officers and radar operators. Japanese naval leadership, reviewing their own reports, reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. American forces possessed technological capabilities that negated Japanese tactical advantages. The superior night vision of Japanese lookouts meant nothing when American radar could see through total darkness. The aggressive offensive tactics that had brought victory at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean failed when American defenders received 15 minutes of advance warning. The quality of Japanese aircrew couldn't overcome American fighters positioned by radar to optimal intercept points. The Battle of Santa Cruz represented the last time Japanese carriers would engage American forces on roughly equal terms. Every subsequent carrier battle would find Japanese forces operating at increasing technological disadvantage as American radar improved, while Japanese forces received minimal upgrades. By 1944, the disparity would be so extreme that Japanese carrier aviation would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. But in October 1942, the outcome was still uncertain. Both sides had suffered. Both sides had learned. The difference was that American forces learned lessons that confirmed their technological approach was correct and should be expanded. Japanese forces learned lessons that revealed fundamental weaknesses they lacked the industrial capacity to address. The radar operators who provided the early warning that shaped the battle received no medals, no public recognition, no mentions in the official histories written immediately after the war. Radioman, Second Class, Robert Morris, who detected the first Japanese strike at 40 miles and provided 90 seconds of advance warning, returned to civilian life after the war and rarely discussed his service. His contribution appeared in no newspaper accounts, no victory narratives, no popular histories of the Pacific War. The fighter direction officers who vectored American fighters to intercept positions based on radar data received slightly more recognition, though their role was overshadowed by the pilots who actually shot down enemy aircraft. The technological advantage that made their jobs possible was treated as background detail rather than the decisive factor it actually was. Enterprise's radar equipment that detected Japanese aircraft throughout the battle was eventually replaced with newer, more capable systems as radar technology advanced rapidly during 1943 and 1944. The CXAM antenna was removed, cut apart, and scrapped. No museum preserved it. No historical society collected it. The physical equipment that provided the information advantage at Santa Cruz was destroyed and forgotten. The pattern would repeat throughout the war. Technology advanced, new systems replaced old ones, the physical artifacts of innovation were discarded. What remained were the tactical lessons learned through combat, encoded in doctrine, training programs, and operational procedures that would shape American naval aviation for decades. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese carrier forces never recovered from the cumulative technological disadvantage that radar represented. Every battle after Santa Cruz found them operating with less warning, less preparation time, less ability to coordinate defenses than their American opponents. The gap widened steadily as American industry produced improved radar systems, while Japanese forces received minimal technological upgrades. By June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carriers operated with fully integrated combat information centers where radar displays, fighter direction, and tactical plotting combined into coordinated systems that provided commanders with God's-eye views of the battlefield. Japanese carriers still relied primarily on visual lookouts and fragmented reporting systems that couldn't match American situational awareness. The result was a massacre. During what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese carrier aircraft were detected by radar at extreme ranges, intercepted by American fighters guided to optimal positions, and shot down in staggering numbers. 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in one day. Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist as an effective force. The technological advantage had expanded from marginal to absolutely decisive. The pilots who survived the Philippine Sea battle and returned to Japan told stories that shocked their commanders. American fighters seemed to know exactly where Japanese formations were heading. They appeared at perfect intercept positions, as if guided by invisible hands. They attacked from optimal angles, exploited formation weaknesses, and disengaged before Japanese fighters could respond effectively. The entire American defensive system operated with coordination that seemed impossible without some form of supernatural knowledge. What seemed supernatural was actually methodical application of radar technology integrated into comprehensive command and control systems. American carriers could detect Japanese aircraft at 70 to 100 miles, depending on altitude and weather. Fighter direction officers tracked the raids continuously, watching their approach vectors, estimating their targets, calculating intercept geometry. Fighters were vectored to positions where they could attack from altitude advantage with sun behind them. The entire defensive system operated with information superiority that Japanese forces couldn't comprehend or counter. Japanese attempts to develop equivalent radar capabilities came too late and achieved too little. The first Type II Mark IV air search radars didn't reach fleet carriers until mid-1944. Performance was inferior to American systems that had been operational since 1942. Detection, range was shorter, reliability was lower, and Japanese forces lacked the trained operators and tactical doctrine to employ radar effectively, even when they had it. More critically, Japanese industry couldn't produce radar sets in quantities approaching American output. While American shipyards installed radar on every combat vessel as standard equipment, Japanese ships received radar sporadically, if at all. Many Japanese warships sunk in late-war battles possessed no radar whatsoever, fighting with technology essentially unchanged from 1941 while facing opponents whose capabilities had advanced dramatically. The industrial disparity explained much of the technological gap. American factories produced radar sets by the thousands. Radiation Laboratory at MIT coordinated development across multiple contractors. Western Electric, General Electric, RCA, and dozens of other companies manufactured components. Assembly plants in multiple states integrated those components into finished radar systems. The supply chain never faltered. When ships needed radar, installation could occur within days. When radar sets failed, replacements arrived immediately. Japanese radar production struggled with chronic shortages of components, skilled labor, and manufacturing capacity. A single radar set might require months to produce due to bottlenecks in vacuum tube production or precision mechanical components. Ships waiting for radar installation might wait months or receive no equipment at all. Units equipped with radar often lacked spare parts for repairs, rendering systems inoperative after minor failures. The technological gap was actually an industrial gap manifesting as military weakness. Japan couldn't build radar fast enough to equip its forces adequately. Japanese engineers understood radar principles as well as their American counterparts. But understanding principles didn't translate into mass production when the industrial base couldn't support it. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war to write extensively about Japanese naval operations, later told American historians that the moment he understood Japan had lost occurred during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, not because of the devastating aircraft losses, though those were severe enough, but because, watching American defensive coordination, understanding American fighters were being guided by radar to intercept positions, recognizing that Japanese carriers possessed no equivalent capability, he realized Japan was fighting a technologically superior opponent with industrial resources that exceeded anything Japanese planners had anticipated. Fuchida's memoirs, published in the 1950s, emphasized the radar differential repeatedly. He explained to Japanese readers that carrier warfare had been revolutionized by electronics in ways that made traditional tactics obsolete. The superior eyesight of Japanese lookouts, the exceptional training of Japanese pilots, the aggressive tactical doctrines Japanese forces employed, all became secondary to the fundamental question of who could see farthest. American radar saw farther than Japanese eyes, and that advantage proved decisive. The lessons Fuchida and other Japanese naval officers drew from their wartime experiences influenced post-war Japanese maritime self-defense force development. When Japan began rebuilding naval forces in the 1950s under American supervision, radar was prioritized from the beginning. Japanese destroyers and escorts mounted American-designed radar systems as standard equipment. Japanese officers trained extensively on radar operation and tactical employment. The mistakes of World War II were studied carefully to avoid repeating them. The technological shock Japanese forces experienced during the war drove home lessons about industrial competition and technological development that shaped Japanese policy for decades. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, and Toshiba that became global electronics leaders in the 1970s and 1980s were partly influenced by military veterans who understood the importance of electronics manufacturing capability. The consumer electronics revolution Japan led during the Cold War had roots in wartime recognition that electronics determined military outcomes. For American forces, the radar advantage became so routine by 1944 that it was simply assumed as part of normal operations. New officers reporting to carriers were trained on radar systems as standard procedure. Fighter direction became a specialized career path with dedicated training schools. The Combat Information Center evolved into the nerve center of the ship, as important as the bridge or engine room. Everything flowed through the CIC, where radar displays painted pictures of the tactical situation. Post-war naval development in America maintained radar as central to all operations. Improved. Systems entered service continuously. By the 1950s, American carriers operated with radar suites that would have seemed like science fiction to operators in 1942. Detection ranges exceeded 200 miles for high-altitude aircraft. Multiple targets could be tracked simultaneously. Computers processed radar data automatically, calculating intercept geometry and cueing weapons systems. The revolution that began with crude CXAM systems providing 40-mile detection evolved into comprehensive surveillance networks that made carrier task forces nearly invulnerable to air attack. Soviet forces, developing their own carrier aviation in the 1960s, faced the same technological challenges Japan had confronted 20 years earlier. They needed radar capabilities matching American systems, or their carriers would be blind in any conflict. The Cold War carrier competition became partly a radar competition. Whoever possessed superior detection range and tracking capability would dominate carrier warfare, just as American forces had dominated Japanese carriers through radar superiority. Soviet electronics development focused heavily on radar throughout the Cold War, driven by recognition that information superiority determined outcomes in modern naval warfare. The original CXAM radar that provided Enterprise with 40-mile detection at Santa Cruz was primitive by 1960 standards, but revolutionary in 1942. The antenna weighed multiple tons, required extensive supporting structure, and was vulnerable to weather and battle damage. The displays were difficult to interpret, showing raw video returns that required experienced operators to distinguish aircraft from weather or sea clutter. The effective range varied dramatically based on target altitude, weather conditions, and equipment maintenance status, but it worked well enough to provide decisive advantage over forces that possessed no equivalent capability. The technological threshold for dominance wasn't perfection. It was being sufficiently better than the opposition that tactical advantages became systematic rather than circumstantial. American radar in 1942 was far from perfect, but it was vastly superior to Japanese optical detection, and that gap proved sufficient. Japanese naval forces attempted tactical adaptations to mitigate American radar advantage. They launched strikes at dawn, when low sun angles made visual detection difficult for defenders. They approached through weather fronts where clouds provided concealment. They flew at wave-top altitudes where radar detection was degraded by sea clutter. These tactics achieved marginal improvements but couldn't overcome the fundamental information disadvantage. American fighter direction officers learned to compensate for Japanese tactical adaptations. Low-altitude approaches were countered by positioning combat air patrols at multiple altitudes, ensuring some fighters could intercept regardless of Japanese attack profile. Weather approaches were anticipated by maintaining radar surveillance in all directions, detecting strikes as they emerged from cloud cover. Dawn attacks faced fighters already airborne and positioned based on radar tracking of Japanese carriers during darkness. The tactical competition resembled an arms race, where one side possessed overwhelming advantages. Japanese forces developed tactics to exploit American weaknesses, but those tactics achieved limited success because the fundamental technological gap was too wide. American forces possessed information dominance that tactical cleverness couldn't overcome. By late 1944, Japanese carrier forces were so depleted that tactical questions became irrelevant. There weren't enough carriers, aircraft, or trained pilots remaining to conduct meaningful offensive operations. The battles of 1942 and 1943 had consumed Japan's carrier striking. Power and industrial limitations prevented replacement at rates necessary to maintain combat effectiveness. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw Japanese carriers used as decoys, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American forces away from invasion beaches. The carriers embarked minimal aircraft because Japan had no carrier-capable pilots remaining. The ships that had formed the core of Japanese naval power in 1941 sailed into battle as hollow shells, their flight decks empty, their purpose reduced to diversion. American carrier forces at Leyte Gulf operated with full air wings, comprehensive radar coverage, and complete air supremacy. The contrast with October 1942 was stark. In 2 years, the technological and industrial advantages that had been marginal at Santa Cruz had expanded into overwhelming dominance. Japanese carrier aviation had been systematically destroyed, unable to replace losses or match American technological improvements. The radar operators who contributed to this transformation remained largely invisible in historical accounts. Their work was technical, unglamorous, and easily overlooked by historians focusing on dramatic combat narratives. But their contribution was fundamental. Without radar detection providing early warning and tracking, American carriers would have faced Japanese strikes with minimal preparation time, just as Japanese carriers faced American attacks. The casualties among American carriers would have been far higher without radar. The Pacific War might have lasted months or years longer if technological advantages hadn't tilted the balance so decisively. The young men who stared at green cathode ray tubes, called out bearing and range numbers, and tracked contacts across electronic displays were as important to victory as the pilots who flew combat missions or the gunners who shot down enemy aircraft. Enterprise survived the war, participating in nearly every major Pacific campaign. She was the most decorated American ship of World War II, earning 20 battle stars for her service. Her radar equipment was upgraded multiple times as technology advanced. The CXAM system that provided early warning at Santa Cruz was replaced by SK air search radar with improved range and accuracy. The SK was later supplemented by SM height-finding radar that could determine target altitude precisely. By war's end, Enterprise bristled with electronic equipment that would have astounded her crew in October 1942. She could detect, track, and coordinate responses to hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. Her Combat Information Center was a sophisticated command node coordinating fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and tactical maneuvering into integrated defensive systems that made successful attack nearly impossible. The ship was scheduled for scrapping in 1946, despite public campaigns to preserve her as a museum. The Navy determined that maintaining obsolete carriers was economically impractical. Enterprise was sold to a scrapping company and cut apart during 1947 and 1948. The radar equipment that had provided decisive advantages during the war was removed, dismantled, and destroyed. None of it survived in museums or collections. The physical artifacts of the technological revolution were treated as disposable. What mattered was the knowledge encoded in training manuals, tactical doctrines, and operational procedures. The equipment itself was just hardware, outdated within years, replaced by better systems, ultimately scrapped and forgotten. Radioman Second Class Robert Morris, who detected the Japanese strike at 40 miles during Santa Cruz, was discharged in 1945 and returned to civilian life in Ohio. He worked as an electronics technician, married, raised 3 children, and rarely discussed his wartime service in detail. His obituary in 1998 mentioned his Navy service, but didn't note his specific contributions to the Battle of Santa Cruz. The anonymity was typical for radar operators across the fleet. Their work was classified during the war, explaining how radar functioned would compromise operational security. After the war, their contributions were overshadowed by more dramatic narratives about pilots and surface combat. The technical specialists who provided the information advantage that made American naval dominance possible remained in the background of historical accounts. This pattern repeated across military history. Technological innovations that fundamentally changed warfare were often underappreciated initially because their contributions were indirect. Radar didn't sink ships or shoot down aircraft directly. It provided information that allowed others to sink ships and shoot down aircraft more effectively. The distinction seemed significant to people writing history, but was irrelevant to tactical outcomes. The Battle of Santa Cruz and the broader carrier warfare campaign in the Pacific demonstrated that information dominance was becoming the decisive factor in modern naval warfare. The side that could detect threats first, track them accurately, and coordinate responses effectively would win regardless of numerical inferiority or traditional tactical disadvantages. Japanese carriers might embark superior aircraft and better pilots, but if American radar detected them first and positioned defenses optimally, those advantages evaporated. The lesson was learned imperfectly by post-war military planners in multiple nations. Some focused on developing better radar systems to match American capabilities. Others emphasized electronic warfare and radar jamming to negate opponents' information advantages. Still others pursued alternative detection methods that didn't rely on radar and might prove immune to countermeasures. The electronic warfare spiral that dominated Cold War military competition had its roots in World War II, carrier battles, where radar provided decisive advantages. Every electronic capability created demand for counter-capability. Radar created demand for radar jamming. Radar jamming created demand for anti-jamming techniques. The cycle continued through multiple generations of technology, each more sophisticated than the last. Modern naval warfare remains fundamentally shaped by information competition. Aircraft carriers operate with radar systems that can detect targets hundreds of miles away. Multiple overlapping sensors create comprehensive tactical pictures. Data links share information across entire battle groups, creating networked awareness that 19th-century admirals couldn't have imagined. The revolution begun in 1942 continues with technology that would astound World War II radar operators. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Whoever sees farthest, tracks most accurately, and coordinates most effectively will dominate. The 90 seconds of warning that American carriers gained through radar detection at Santa Cruz represented the first tactical expression of a principle that would dominate naval warfare for the next 80 years and counting. Information is power. Technology that provides information advantage provides combat advantage. Industrial capacity to produce that technology determines who dominates. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.